In the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder, the US government has made persecuting the entire left wing its new goal. Why is it so afraid of the left? What is the left, and what does it pose a threat to? And why is pursuing the left so much more urgent than the right? What's the difference between left and right? Because I had heard they were the same. Someone told me the extremes of left and right curl back in to meet at the bottom where they're just as bad. Do they? Are they? No. Me niego a morir en la vía, ni trabajar para la policía, ni andar de cuento, ni andar de tranza para poder llenarme la panza. This is the Political Compass. It's a quick way of visualizing what people of different philosophies think. You've got the Northeasties, the Tankies, the Anarchies, But it doesn't necessarily tell us what anyone believes individually. Nowadays, everyone has their own beliefs, some of which contradict each other. Because we're people. The simplest way to distinguish left-wing from right-wing is the left favors equality, and the right is fine with inequality. To me, right and left are tendencies that you can move toward or away from while calling yourself whatever you want. For example, racism is inherently right-wing because of the inequality it assumes, but just because you have some conservative opinions doesn't mean it's fair to assume your motivations are racist, at least not consciously. Conversely, just being a socialist does not mean you're never racist, nor is it a get-out-of-shitty-behavior-free card. We're more complicated than that. We're all at different points in our journey. The political compass can't reflect us perfectly. In fact, a lot of points on this chart are only possible in theory. There's no such thing as an extremely authoritarian state that's also fiercely anti-racist, as you would theoretically find in the top left corner. Because in practice, such a state would rely on exclusion and marginalization of one or more identifiable groups to give the people an enemy. The left wing does not include liberals. Sorry. Left wing means socialist, which is fundamentally at odds with capitalism, while capitalism is the dominant economic system under liberalism. Usually when leftists talk about the left, they don't include liberals that don't have at least some strong criticism of capitalism. Transitioning from capitalism to socialism would be a radical change, whereas liberalism is not a change. It's the system we already live under, or at least used to. Therefore, radical liberal is an oxymoron and usually just a joke. Individually, liberals might be farther left than leftists, like on racism or other systemic prejudices. And this compass is just about people's views. Liberals might still do valuable work. But one of the left's biggest frustrations with liberals is how they tend to side with the powerful, including the fascist right, rather than support socialists trying to realize ideals like freedom that liberals claim to believe in. One gets the impression they would rather return to a semblance of normal than work for change. Sorry to be the one, but there's no going back. Time doesn't work like that. We can make the future better, or we can let it get worse. A great introduction to criticism of white liberals can be found in Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, so I'll put a link in the description. The right wing tends to like capitalism, and to see the vast inequality of ownership, wealth, and power that comes from it as warranted, or inevitable. They're big fans of individual merit and individual responsibility, with less emphasis on how social systems work, how culture and other amorphous forces affect us. They might care more about institutions and traditions, or at least what they say are traditions, than human lives, especially the lives of those below them in the social hierarchy. You might have heard right-wingers from Rush Limbaugh to Charlie Kirk stirring up fear and hatred and calling for the marginalization of whole groups of people. When people who listen to them kill the people they were talking about, the demagogues deflect criticism by saying They didn't literally call for murder or personally pull the trigger. We know their words cause violence, that's why they say them. Researchers found that counties hosting Trump campaign rallies in the run-up to the 2016 US presidential election saw subsequent increases in hate-motivated incidents. Trump's election in 2016 is empirically associated with a surge in hate crimes. Lipscomb 2017 reported that in the wake of the 2016 election, 1/4 of perpetrators of hate crimes in Florida indicated Trump and his policies and statements as motivators for their attacks. Nakos et al. 2020 found that violence and violent threats increased during Trump's term in office, while Levine 2020 and Swain and Adolph 2019 identified over 50 cases of violence in which the perpetrators invoked Trump's influence as an explanation or justification for their behaviors. But if you refuse to acknowledge the effects of your words, you never have to admit responsibility for anything. A justice system that only punishes individual perpetrators and downplays the importance of causes can never stop the violence. The more arbitrary the criterion we're judging someone on, the higher up the scale we are. So if you love capitalism but oppose racism, you might be lower right or center right or whatever. If you had racist and misogynist views, you'd be higher up. Once people reach the authoritarian right, they just want someone to bully, so they'll embrace all the dehumanizing prejudices. They'll believe in all the supremacies. Our race and gender and religion were chosen by God or history or destiny to dominate the rest. They might also believe all humans think the same as them, which would mean it's kill or be killed. The left wants equality, but it isn't always sure how to get there. There's often a disconnect between what leftists do and tolerate and what they say they value. You can see the disconnect at an organizational level, and there's a link in the description to a zine about red flags when joining a leftist organization. But you also see this disconnect in many leftists' view of revolution. Since people assume a state is the best or only way to make change, many leftist movements have focused on capturing state power and using it to transform society. When successful, such revolutions bring down the old order and replace it with a new and not necessarily better one. The tools of the state are police, spies, prisons, and forced labor. Because there are so many reactionaries, the so-called socialist states tend to employ mass murder and mass incarceration. Among their first targets are libertarian socialists like anarchists, because anyone down left from you is likely to question why you should have power at all. This strategy clears the way for the new ruling class to take absolute power. So in the quest for freedom and equality, socialist states end up reinventing the problem. Horseshoe Theory implies you can identify extremes of left and right, and assumes they'll converge. So what do extremes of left and right look like? Some people think of the USSR or other nominally socialist state as the extreme because it's one of the only things they know of to associate with the left. But according to its literature and some of its history, the left is about liberation. These states didn't liberate. In many cases, they made living conditions better, but improved living conditions are not liberation. They are what happens when the ruling class shares some of the wealth it appropriates. Some leftists try to tell me the gulags were kind and compassionate compared with prisons of today's United States. It makes me think, first, were they? Second, by all means compare prison state A with prison state B, but it's not likely to win over anyone who cares about liberation. Anarchists, like me way down in the bottom left corner, want to solve this problem by destroying the state and other institutions of social hierarchy so no one can take power. I think it's our best bet for freedom, but it'll take at least 6 months. So it's very much a long-term goal. But it's not just anarchists who want a classless future. Socialist philosophy in general does envision the end of the state, where the workers control the means of production and no one can dominate them. Picture it. No states making our decisions for us. Everyone governs themselves and associates and solves conflicts how they see fit. No police or prisons to remove people from society just because the ruling class disapproves of their behavior. People would find peaceful ways to resolve conflicts and deal with offenders, like they always have. I know, some people find these ideas terrifying. Subscribe and I'll explain it and you'll see the logic. There's no money to give some people power and others poverty. Everyone has access to what gets produced. No one is forced to live in the street or go hungry. Space is used to meet people's needs rather than just make money. People could move around the world as they liked, but they would also learn to be respectful of the land and culture of where they were. We wouldn't have to work for others to survive, just for what we need. There are millions of jobs that aren't necessary that we could just give up. Since we would be working together with the latest technology, there would probably hardly be any work to do. Tons of work people don't especially want to do has been automated. Today, the means of production, like the factories, machines, formulas, and techniques, are privately owned by a few shareholders. If the workers in the industry were in charge, they could reorient the work to serve human needs, or just abandon the work altogether and do something else. They would be in cooperation rather than in competition. So one's success is everyone's success, and there would be no reason to sabotage or stab each other in the back. They could automate to give themselves time off and make everyone's work easier. I think there should be unity between means and ends. If your goal is a free society, everyone should be free unless there's a really good reason why they shouldn't, like a history of predatory violence. If we want to eliminate the prison, we'll need other ways of preventing harm, like restorative or transformative justice. If we want to eliminate police, we'll need other ways of responding to crises. Fortunately, there are people working on those things, not just with the goal of establishing a free society in the future, but to serve their communities in the present. You might say that vision for a free and equal society isn't what all leftists want, and of course you'd be right. But we're talking about extremes. As a leftist extremist who's read some of the philosophy, that's my vision. Because that's what communism is. If you thought communism meant a big, powerful state like the USSR, all I'll say is propaganda changes the meanings of words. If you don't believe me, read the first paragraph in Wikipedia. Communism is a political and economic ideology whose goal is the creation of a communist society, a socio-economic order centered on common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange that allocates products in society based on need. A communist society entails the absence of private property and social classes, and ultimately money and the state. So it's not a state. It's just that some communists think that the right state can vanguard us to communism, while people like me think the state can only ever reproduce authority and inequality and the violence needed to enforce it. Sometimes when I explain this difference to people who aren't on the left, they say, it's the same thing. It would all lead to a totalitarian state. And that's because they're trying to make left-wing horseshoe theory a thing. In practice, these differences lead to very different strategies and outcomes, so the authoritarian and libertarian left have trouble working together. They've had disagreements. As a result of this division and 2 centuries of propaganda, which have led to man-made horrors beyond my comprehension, the word communism isn't super useful anymore. What I think matters most is freedom as a means and an end, so that's what I talk about. Either way, you can see why authority would feel threatened by anything hinting at communism. Communists want to take power away from those few who monopolize it and give it to everyone. So that's the left. What's the extreme right-wing vision? Well, the typical far-right vision is a return to Nazi Germany. Yeah. There are still a lot of Nazis around. It would be different next time, obviously. Again, there's no going back in time, just forward. It could be much worse than Nazi Germany, especially with modern technology. A few people would have all the wealth, and everyone else would be terrified to disobey them. The likes of Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin seem to want everyone to live under constant supervision while they constantly work. Yes, not everyone you could call right-wing wants what those guys want, but again, this is the extreme, and Horseshoe Theory says the extremes inevitably come together. If Horseshoe Theory were valid, the futures envisioned by the far right and those by the anarchist communist left would have a lot in common, but they have nothing in common. If Horseshoe Theory could explain anything, in other words, if it were a theory, you would see people on the extremes teaming up. But what would they team up on? Their values are opposite. And that's why I hate when people say, we hate each other just for a difference of opinion. Opinion on what? Opinion on what, fucker? Yes, we differ on the topic of genocide. We disagree on whether huge groups of people should be treated as people or not. We butt heads on whether or not millions of people should be incarcerated and enslaved for their skin color. Yes, I want to stop them targeting my friends for deportation and execution. Should we just agree to disagree with them, like Ezra Klein? Such an approach would necessarily mean abandoning the vulnerable and marginalized to the predations of the right wing, which can never be satisfied. While you agreed to disagree with racists, they printed $100 billion for borders and took away everyone's freedom to move around the world. While you agreed to disagree with misogynists, they killed the freedom to get an abortion. While you were saying the transphobes are just concerned parents, they criminalized trans healthcare and pushed trans people out of public life. Yes, we hold different opinions, and yes, that difference is a good reason to use force. So when people say, it's not left versus right, it's the people versus oligarchy or something, I think they're the same struggle. The left opposes fascism and, in theory, oligarchy because they have very similar causes and effects. In fact, at some point you can't really have one without the other. Powerful rulers provide us with scapegoats to distract us. The wealthy fund movements aimed at dividing us with bigotry. People can amass wealth and power as much as they like if not enough people actively oppose them. If people would rather persecute trans people and migrants than fight oligarchy, they are the foot soldiers of the oligarchs. There are sometimes supposed right-left team-ups, but they're usually just the result of some group or person that was left-wing giving up on left-wing values, or just giving up on the pretense, and collaborating with the right. Black Hammer claimed to be left-wing black resistance, but also spouted right-wing talking points and worked with the Proud Boys. But these leftists collaborating with fascists, conspiracy theorists, and science deniers has become a big problem, and you can read Naomi Klein's book Doppelganger to learn more. If nothing else, the book demonstrates how misleading people's labels can be nowadays, and how hard it can be to place people on the compass. I think often when people talk about extremes, they just mean when people start getting fanatical. If you're so keen on realizing your vision for society, you're willing to kill or lock up and put to work millions of people, there's not likely to be much difference between you and your left or right counterpart. You need power to kill and lock up millions. Power is what's really at the ends of the horseshoe. When people start grabbing at absolute power, they'll say whatever, work with whoever, do anything. You have to put aside your values until the only thing you care about is power. As ideologies aimed at decentralizing power, communists, anarchists, and anti-fascists are the ideological enemies of the right wing and the capitalist state. As a result, they've been smeared and criminalized and killed by people with power for about 2 centuries. Trump's anti-anti-fascist memo was a continuation of that trend. Another recent Trump order effectively criminalized anti-fascist beliefs. Common threads animating this violent conduct include anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, so opposing installing a Christian theocracy. Support for the overthrow of the United States government, which is interesting because if Democrats had implemented that one, it would have implicated millions of Republicans. Extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality, which I'm pretty sure means they're going to legalize men owning their wives. They're right, of course. Anti-fascists are a threat to their plans. Anti-fascism would imply opposing virtually everything the Trump administration is doing. Centralizing power, killing independent media and academia, ethnic cleansing, human trafficking, murder, bans on abortion and transitioning. So we can see why the US government would want to attack and destroy the left. But does the left, or mix Antifa, even really exist? They're not organizations. It's a really broad group of people who are permanently split along ideological lines. What the US can do is go after formal organizations and say they're funding terrorism, because everything is terrorism if I don't like it, give harsh sentences to anyone they claim is Antifa, play up the threat of left-wing terrorism, and use it to invade the US mainland. The corporate media, including supposedly liberal papers like The Atlantic and the New York Times, are either caving to pressure from Trump or just following the lead of the wealthy owner of the paper and reporting on the evils of the left, as if they could be compared with the everyday actions of the right. They're preparing the ground for the new Red Scare that's coming. Meanwhile, every day, right-wingers commit mass shootings and engage in CSA, and most media don't seem able to connect the dots. It makes sense the government would use the word extreme. It's like terrorist, a meaningless label to put on your enemies. I don't like how Nazism and fascism get called extremism because it implies the problem with them is that they're extreme, rather than that they're extremely authoritarian. While I can give a dozen reasons why we shouldn't accept authoritarianism, what's inherently wrong with being extreme? We live in extreme times. These are the days of incalculable wealth existing alongside abject poverty. When you can make war on people on the other side of the world. When the ruling class is trying to put everyone under surveillance and still tell you you're free. We're stuck in an extreme situation. Why would you take a moderate approach to it? From Letter from a Birmingham Jail, the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? If you know what's going on and you take it seriously, you might already be a radicalized extremist. But don't worry, that doesn't mean you have anything in common with the far right.